Last Friday, Buzzfeed published a piece saying that it had an exclusive of a study by academics at Oxford and LSE proving that 70% of the British public are now in favour of hard Brexit. But here's the thing, not one participant actually said that they were in favour of hard Brexit, and it isn't new polling data, but rather it was a study done back in April, and that's the main take-home message. But let's go through how it happened. So essentially, what the authors of this study were trying to do was to take a whole bunch of people, some of whom voted Remain and some of whom voted Leave, and present them both with menu lists of Brexit deals and how they could work. So you have one set of 8 versus another set of 8, and the items in them are sort of randomized, and they could be about the European Court of Justice or the size of the divorce bill or so forth and so on. And by presenting people with forced choice between different options, you get to see which of those items are complete deal breakers or which of those items really make the menu look strong for people. That was the whole idea behind it. Now, the authors themselves, what are their conclusions? Because after the Buzzfeed thing came out, they decided to publish their own piece on LSE blogs explaining what they had found and what their own conclusions were. Their own conclusions were that lots of people were quite flexible about these options. The only real deal breakers seemed to be the influence of the European Court of Justice and immigration controls for Leave voters, and for Remain voters the key thing was guaranteeing EU citizens' rights continue. Apart from that, there was a lot of flexibility. So that was their headline conclusion. However, what had Buzzfeed produced, which then went absolutely viral and found its way through Breitbart, Guido Fawkes, all of the tabloids, and also onto the BBC, I'm told, is that there was a new study of 20,000 people that have found that approximately 70% of them would prefer a no-deal Brexit to a soft Brexit. And again, nearly 70% would prefer a hard Brexit to a soft Brexit. So how did that come about? Well, essentially, the 20,000 figure is wrong. It was nearly 20,000 data points from 3,000 people, and the Buzzfeed article neglected to say that these were actually data from April, the end of April. And I would remind you, at the end of April, that was 1 week after Theresa May called her snap election, when she was riding high in the polls. Everyone thought hard Brexit was probably a dead cert. Jeremy Corbyn's favourability rating was -42, and no one had heard of the DUP. So things have changed a lot since when these data were taken. So these are not up-to-date polling data. And then the other thing is, with the hard Remain versus soft Remain versus no-deal Brexit options, these were 3 bundles that the authors constructed and got the participants to choose between. So the participants, not a single participant actually said that they preferred hard Brexit or soft Brexit or no-deal Brexit. The bundles weren't even labelled as such because the study authors were trying to get round this. But it's a real stretch to say that if you pick this bundle, which is hard Brexit, then you're actually for hard Brexit. Why? Because it's hard to describe the full soft Brexit, hard Brexit or no deal Brexit in just 8 items, and then it depends how you describe them. For example, you could ask me if I would pick a deal in which there were no payments, complete control by the British government, no divorce bill, and UK control over immigration, versus huge payments with no description of what they are. If I picked the first, because that would only be logical in this circumstance, and then you told me that my preference is actually for a no-deal Brexit, well then I'd be very annoyed, because I'd say it goes far beyond this set of 8 versus that set of 8, and then also you haven't put in here all of the consequences that I believe a no-deal Brexit would bring. So it can't actually be extrapolated from that. And in their explanatory blog on LSE blog a few days later, the authors didn't mention anything about these three bundles, and I think I'm guessing that they're really rethinking that. And they were sticking with a conclusion that the study itself is interesting for methodology because it allows a comparison of which of the individual items are more deal breakers than others, which is a valid thing to do. The other problem with how it was presented by Buzzfeed when it put out is they put out a series of charts in which it had lots of different items ranked from 0% to 100%. And one of those charts was about solutions for immigration. And one of those items was all must leave, as in all EU citizens must leave, must be deported. And that got a 29% rating for the Remain voters and a 43% rating for the Leave voters. So that was interpreted by an independent article as 29% of Remainers would deport EU citizens, which caused a lot of stress. Now, is that actually the case? Well, no, not in the real world. First of all, this was a forced choice scenario where you had to pick between one option list and another option list, whether you like them or not. It's not understood how well people understood that all must leave would actually mean active deportation, and people weren't allowed to choose an option to refuse. So that doesn't mean that people would actually support that in the real world. I don't think that was a good option to include because it's not a realistic one, because no one politically is advocating it. So that caused more problems, and the way that those scales should have been presented was not 0% for absolute rejection to 100% for absolute acceptance, but rather with 50%, the perfect meh, being a 0, and anything below that being negative, and anything above that being positive. And then you would actually see on the scales that the concept of all must leave was actually the most repulsive item to everyone in the whole set. That's how it should have been phrased, and this is one of the reasons why also you should probably go through peer review before you leak an exclusive to Buzzfeed, and then don't check the final version so thoroughly. So, as my own sort of peer review of this work, actually having seen the version published by the authors, what's good and what's not? Overall, the methodology is useful and creative. It's been used before, and it is a good way to test out what items are acceptable to the public and different parts of the public and what not. I mean, it identified those immigration aspects and European Court of Justice aspects for the Leave voters, and similarly for supporting EU citizens for Remain voters, and general aversion to a higher divorce bill. An interesting other thing that popped out of it was for the Irish border, the most popular solution for Leave voters was complete passport checks and complete customs checks at the border, which I think is concerning. So the method is valid. The results are not valid for now, because now we're in August and this is a snapshot from back in April, so it's no use for us now. So how would you make it, to be of use? And it would either be do this again and then publish the results within a few days of data collection, or keep doing this on a regular basis, a rolling basis, so that you can actually see changes in opinion over time and track that. Those would be the ways to make it relevant, but you can't mix this kind of stuff in with current polling for all the reasons I've described. The part that I would say is invalid is saying that these three bundles, which they labelled as no deal Brexit, soft Brexit and hard Brexit, actually map on to preferences of the public overall, because they are so much more complex in those 8 descriptors, because you can't measure in concepts such as sovereignty and what price freedom and national identity versus international identity versus beliefs of economic impact and impact to rights and all of that stuff. You can't extrapolate accurately from these bundles to actual decisions in the real world, and I think that's why the authors dropped it from their own explanation And I hope that, peer review would catch that as well. So the moral of the story is that for academics and responsible journalists alike, you have to catch these things early and double check these things. You shouldn't really go publishing stuff before peer review, and then when you do communicate stuff to journalists, you have to make sure that the presentation is tight and checked. And if you're a journalist, make sure you understand it thoroughly, because once the horse bolts on something like this, it chases right throughout society into pubs and family conversations where corrections can't get at it. And so what this has done is given a lot of people the belief that suddenly 70% of the UK population is behind a very, very hard Brexit, when that is clearly not the case. So that is a massive problem, and we'll be dealing with that for a while. If you ever see it pop up in social media, just say it's from April and no one ever said what kind of Brexit they preferred, that was extrapolated, and then point them to either this video or another piece written on it. But this is what happens in the real world as well, because there is pressure on academics to get things out quickly and to be part of societal conversation. And there's also pressure on journalists to be fast more than to be accurate. And it is quite ironic that this particular Buzzfeed author who wrote this piece is also the author of a new book just out called Post-Truth: How Bullshit Conquered the World.